2 years before Ghana's president was overthrown, he wrote a letter to the President of the United States accusing American intelligence officers of working against him inside his own country. And 2 years later, when the coup he predicted actually happened, the paperwork proving he was right had already been sitting inside American government files the entire time. That president was Kwame Nkrumah, the man who led Ghana out of British rule and spent the years after that trying to unite the whole continent under one flag. By the time Nkrumah sat down to write that letter, he wasn't some young voice shouting from the sidelines anymore. He was one of the most recognized leaders on the entire continent, and the road that got him there started years earlier, thousands of miles from home, while he was still a student. Nkrumah grew up in the Gold Coast, a British colony on Africa's west coast, meaning Britain owned it and made every major decision about it from thousands of miles away, taking its gold and its cocoa, while its own people had no real say in how the country was run. Nkrumah left to study in the United States and then in London, and it was there, meeting other African and black thinkers from around the world, that he landed on an idea that would shape the rest of his life. A handful of small, separate African nations, even free ones, could still be pushed around individually by richer, more powerful countries. The only real protection was numbers. If Africa's nations stood together instead of standing alone, no single outside power could dictate terms to any one of them. That idea had a name: Pan-Africanism, the belief that people of African descent everywhere shared a common cause and needed to unite around it. He brought that idea home in 1947, and within 10 years he'd pulled off something almost nobody thought possible. On March 6, 1957, Ghana became independent, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to break free of colonial rule. But Independence Day wasn't the finish line for Nkrumah. It was the starting gun. He told the crowds that day that Ghana's freedom meant nothing if it stopped at Ghana's own borders, and he spent the next several years trying to prove it, pushing hardest in 1963 when he helped found the Organization of African Unity, a group meant to bring independent African nations together to act as one voice instead of dozens of separate competing ones. Nkrumah wanted to go even further than that, arguing for a single African government, a single military, a single currency. But the other leaders in the room wanted to move more carefully, and the version of unity that actually got built was smaller and slower than the one Nkrumah had been fighting for. That fight to build something real out of that idea would very quickly cost him. In 1958, at a Pan-African conference Nkrumah hosted in Accra, he met a younger politician from the Congo named Patrice Lumumba, and the two became close allies almost immediately. When the Congo won its independence in 1960 and collapsed into chaos within days, Ghana was the first country to send troops to support Lumumba's new government, and behind closed doors, the two men secretly agreed to merge Ghana and Congo into a single union, meant to be the first real building block of exactly the kind of united Africa Nkrumah had been arguing for. A private letter Nkrumah had written to Lumumba later got leaked to the public, twisted into proof that Nkrumah was meddling in another country's affairs rather than what it actually was, one ally trying to help another survive. Then, in January 1961, Lumumba was murdered, killed with the direct involvement of Belgian and American intelligence officers working alongside Congolese rivals who wanted him gone. For Nkrumah, it wasn't only the loss of a friend and an ally, it was proof of exactly what he'd feared all along, that any African leader who tried to build real independence, the kind that didn't answer to outside powers, could be removed by the very same governments claiming to respect that independence. He had no way of knowing yet how personally that lesson was about to apply to him. Lumumba's death didn't just sadden Nkrumah. It changed how he ran his own country, and understanding that change means understanding what came before it, because Nkrumah's fear of being removed wasn't some abstract worry. People had already tried to kill him. On August 1, 1962, in a town called Kulungugu, near Ghana's northern border, a bomb went off as Nkrumah's convoy passed through a crowd welcoming him home from a trip abroad. The blast killed a young girl who had approached to present him with flowers. Nkrumah survived with non-life-threatening injuries, treated for shrapnel wounds. Some accounts from the time reported a higher death toll, though later retellings consistently described just the one. It wasn't an isolated incident either. Over the next 2 years, more attempts followed, enough that by the mid-1960s, Nkrumah genuinely believed, with real reason, that there were people both inside Ghana and outside it actively trying to end his life. How he responded to that fear says as much about him as the fear itself. Back in 1958, years before any of the bombings, Nkrumah had already pushed through something called the Preventive Detention Act, a law that let his government lock people up for as long as 5 years without ever proving in a courtroom that they'd committed a crime. After Kulungugu, several men were arrested and put on trial for the bombing. A jury heard the case and found them not guilty. Nkrumah's response wasn't to accept that verdict. He removed the judge who had overseen the trial from his position and had the same men tried again in front of a different jury, one that convicted them the second time around. Whatever the truth of who was actually behind that bomb, what Nkrumah did afterward was a president reaching directly into his own country's court system and overturning a verdict he didn't like. That decision, made in the name of safety, was about to open a door he couldn't close again. While Nkrumah was tightening his grip on power, he was also pouring everything he had into a single massive project, one meant to prove that Ghana could build itself into a real industrial power instead of staying dependent on the countries that used to rule it. The plan was called the Volta River Project, centered on a huge new dam at Akosombo. The idea was straightforward. Ghana's economy ran almost entirely on selling raw cocoa beans to the rest of the world, and that made the whole country vulnerable, because Ghana had no control over what price it got paid. A dam on the Volta River could generate electricity, and that electricity could power factories, including a large aluminum smelter, so Ghana could start processing its own raw materials instead of shipping them out cheap and buying them back expensive as finished goods. It was a serious plan for building a stronger economy, not just a vanity project. But building it came at a steep cost. Ghana borrowed heavily from foreign lenders to pay for it, and building the dam flooded a huge stretch of land to create what became one of the largest man-made lakes in the world, displacing roughly 80,000 people from around 700 villages to make room for the water. And the timing worked against Nkrumah in a way he couldn't control. Cocoa prices on the world market, the same prices Ghana depended on to pay off everything it was borrowing, fell sharply through the mid-1960s and collapsed further in the second half of 1964. Ghana was taking on more debt at the exact moment its main source of income was losing value, and that combination pushed the country toward a financial crisis, one that was still unfolding when the dam was finally finished. At the same time this was happening, Nkrumah moved to lock down his political power completely. In 1964, Ghana held a vote asking citizens whether the country should officially become a one-party state, meaning Nkrumah's own convention People's Party would be the only political party allowed to exist legally, with no opposition permitted. The vote passed by a margin historians consider almost impossible to believe as an honest count, and it made Nkrumah president of both the country and the only party allowed to run it for life. Ghana now had a leader who couldn't be voted out, a court system he'd already shown he was willing to override, and a growing debt problem with no clear way out. None of these pressures were slowing down, and Nkrumah was running out of room to manage them all at once. By the mid-1960s, Nkrumah had a debt crisis building at home and a one-party government with no one left to check his decisions. But the danger that ended his presidency wasn't coming from one direction. It was building in 3 separate places at the same time, and Nkrumah didn't have a clear view of any of them. The first was the police. On January 2, 1964, a police officer opened fire near Nkrumah and killed one of his bodyguards. Nkrumah's response was to disarm Ghana's entire police force and strip away intelligence powers the police had held for years, moving that authority under his own office instead. To the many police officers who had nothing to do with the shooting, this felt like collective punishment, and it left lasting resentment inside a force that had once been loyal to him. The second was the army, and part of the problem there was money. Ordinary soldiers' pay had fallen well behind the rising cost of living through the mid-1960s, while Nkrumah's own presidential guard, a separate unit he'd pulled out from under regular army command years earlier, was better equipped and better resourced than the ordinary soldiers protecting the rest of the country. A regular army officer watching that gap grow had a very concrete reason to be angry. No foreign influence required. The third storm was the one Nkrumah's own letter was trying to warn against. In February 1964, 2 full years before the coup actually happened, American Secretary of State Dean Rusk asked the CIA's director to study whether a takeover led by a specific Ghanaian general, Joseph Ankra, could work. That same month, Nkrumah wrote directly to President Lyndon Johnson, accusing American intelligence officers of running operations against him from inside the U.S. Embassy in Accra. Declassified American records from this same period also describe American officials discussing a joint plan with Britain, aimed at slowly weakening Nkrumah's government until it collapsed under its own pressure rather than being pushed. Through 1965, the CIA's own station in Accra kept quietly tracking coup plotting as it developed inside Ghana, filing reports on exactly which officers were involved and how far the planning had gone. None of this proves Washington built the plot from nothing. The men doing the actual planning in the police and the army already had their own Ghanaian reasons, built from years of grievances that had nothing to do with any foreign government. But American officials knew in detail that something was coming, and they chose not to warn the one man it was aimed at. 3 separate fires, each burning for its own reason, all pointed at the same target. All that was left was the spark. January 1966 was the month everything Nkrumah had been building and everything working against him finally collided, and it happened fast. The previous year, in August 1965, Nkrumah had forced his own most senior military commanders into retirement, including General Joseph Ankra, the exact officer Washington had discussed a year and a half earlier as a possible replacement for him. Nkrumah did it because he suspected they were involved in plotting against him, and for a while it worked, disrupting an earlier coup attempt before it could get off the ground. But removing Ankra from active command didn't remove him from the picture. It just meant that when the moment finally came, he was already sitting on the outside, free to be pulled back in. Then, on January 22, 1966, the Akosombo Dam was completed. It was the single achievement Nkrumah had staked so much on, the proof that his vision for an industrialized, self-sufficient Ghana could actually work, and it arrived at almost the exact moment the pressure building against him was reaching its peak. Just days later, a wave of military coups swept through West Africa, including one in neighboring Nigeria in mid-January. Nkrumah publicly welcomed that Nigerian coup, without any sign that he understood how closely his own officers were watching it, or what they were learning from how easily it had happened. On February 21, 1966, Nkrumah left Ghana on a diplomatic trip to China and North Vietnam, personally invited by Ho Chi Minh to help try to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War. American officials had encouraged the trip, going as far as offering to pause the bombing of North Vietnam to help make Nkrumah's visit safer. The same government that had spent 2 years quietly tracking a plot against him was, at that exact time, helping smooth the road for him to be out of the country when it finally happened. He boarded the plane believing he was about to help end a war on the other side of the world. He had no idea his own government wouldn't survive the trip. Before dawn on February 24, 1966, 600 Ghanaian soldiers were marched 435 miles south from the north of the country toward the capital, Accra, and most of them had no clear idea what they were being used for. They'd first been told they were mobilizing over the crisis in Rhodesia. Once they reached Accra, the story changed again, and they were told Nkrumah was preparing to send Ghanaian troops to fight in Vietnam. Neither story was true. They were being marched straight toward their own president's residence. The coup was led by Colonel Emmanuel Kotoka, Major Akwasi Afrifa, the retired General Joseph Ankra, and Police Commissioner John Harley, the Army, the retired officers, and the police finally acting together at once. Ghana's broadcasting house was seized within the first hours of the morning, and Kotoka went on the radio to tell the country that Nkrumah's government had fallen. The heaviest fighting happened at Flagstaff House, Nkrumah's residence, where his presidential guard, the same unit that had long been better equipped than the regular army, held their ground and refused to surrender. Ghana's most senior officer on duty that morning, General Charles Barwa, was shot dead during the coup, an act Nkrumah himself later described in his own writing as one of the worst of the entire operation, though the specific claim that he was killed for refusing to cooperate comes from a single account and is worth treating as reported rather than fully settled. When Kotoka threatened to bomb Flagstaff House if the guards didn't stand down, it wasn't a general or a diplomat who ended the standoff. It was Nkrumah's wife, Fathia Nkrumah, who convinced the guards to lay down their weapons and stop the fighting. How many people died that day is genuinely disputed. Ghana's military government put the official count at 20 presidential guards killed and 25 wounded. Other sources, including a biographer who knew Nkrumah personally, say the toll was far higher and there's no way to reconcile the two. Word of the coup's success reached Washington within days, and the reaction there is on record too. CIA Director Richard Helms sent a memo to the White House describing what had happened, with a handwritten note on it calling it a favorable report to end on. What isn't settled is how far American involvement went beyond that. A former CIA officer later claimed in his own memoir that the agency's station chief in Accra had personally engineered the coup and was rewarded for it afterward. Other historians working from the same declassified American records say what's proven is that Washington knew the coup was coming and welcomed it once it happened, not that American officials designed or directed it themselves. Both of those things can be true without canceling each other out, and holding on to that distinction, rather than flattening it into one simple story, is the honest way to describe what happened in February 1966. The new National Liberation Council moved fast once it took power. It dissolved Nkrumah's party, suspended the Constitution, and released the political prisoners jailed under the Preventive Detention Act, the same law Nkrumah had once used to hold people without trial for years. Nkrumah never returned to Ghana alive. Guinea's president, Sékou Touré, gave him asylum and made him an honorary co-president of that country instead, a title heavy with symbolism but empty of power. From exile, Nkrumah kept writing and kept arguing for African unity right up until the end, and he died in Bucharest, Romania in April 1972 of cancer. What survived him is still argued over, and that argument has never fully settled. Some point to the debt, the one-party rule, and the jailed opponents as proof his own choices brought the collapse on himself. Others point to the opposite conclusion, that the same things Nkrumah built, wider access to education, a more informed public, eventually produced Ghanaians who could see through his government's propaganda and stopped accepting it, meaning the very achievements he was proudest of helped undo him. And there's the piece the declassified American records add to both of those explanations, without replacing either one. Powerful outside interests wanted him gone, and did nothing to stop it once his own people moved. One piece of his story survived almost by accident. Nkrumah's personal cameraman, Chris Hesse, secretly held on to more than 1,000 rolls of film that the new government had ordered destroyed after the coup. Decades later, that footage became the basis of a documentary about this exact era of Ghana's history. The pictures outlasted the government that tried to erase them. Nkrumah spent his life trying to build one united Africa, and Lumumba wasn't the only ally who lost everything trying to help him do it. Does that mean the idea itself can't survive contact with power? Or does it mean something else was always going to get in the way? Let us know what you think in the comments. This has been episode 29 of TerraVox, part of our ongoing look at the leaders and turning points that shaped modern Africa. Subscribe or follow so you don't miss episode 30. See you in the next one.